Good afternoon, everyone. My pleasure to welcome you here to this afternoon's workshop on preparing poetry for submission to the Mairtín Crawford Award for 2024. I should introduce myself. I suppose some of you will know me through many years, decades actually, of teaching creative writing at Ulster University. My name is Kathleen McCracken. I've published 8 books of poetry, one of which is a bilingual edition of selected poems. I'm here today with fellow poet Dawn Watson, who is the author of 2 collections. One, the first of hers, is entitled The Stack of Owls is Getting Higher, a title for anyone to be envious of, I think. And the second, We Play Here. And Dawn will say a bit more about herself when she comes on in a moment. To begin with, what I would like to say is really just what the workshop is going to involve. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the award, the background, the history to the Mairtín Crawford Award. Dawn will then come in and talk about practicalities, the criteria for the award, and how you should go about submitting. And then together we're going to discuss some key areas, not just about this award and submitting to this award, but about writing poetry in general, but with relating that to this project particularly. So to begin with, the history of the Mairtín Crawford Award. Some of you will have heard of Mairtín Crawford. Some of you will have known him. It was inaugurated in 2017 by the poet Moira Donaldson. It's now in its eighth year, so it's been going for a while. And there is a short story award that runs alongside it, and some of you may be submitting to both of these awards. It's an award for new and emerging poets, that is, poets who are working towards a first collection. And it was created really as a way of honoring Mairtín Crawford. He was a good friend of Moira Donaldson's, a writer, a poet, an arts critic. He died tragically, suddenly in 2004. And I think Moira and other poets, particularly at the Crescent Arts, wanted to acknowledge the importance of his encouragement of and influence on poets and poetry in Northern Ireland. Mairtín was born in Belfast, went to Queen's University. He was part of a poetry group that centered around Gyro's poetry collective in Belfast. And out of that, he became the editor of a radical poetry journal known as The Big Spoon, as well as working with Fortnight. He was arts and culture editor for Fortnight magazine for a good number of years. He was also a creative writing facilitator at the Crescent Arts Centre, and then was eventually appointed writer in residence there. While he was writer in residence, he became the director of the Between the Lines Festival, which then evolved into the Belfast Book Festival. So I think, through that nexus of facts about his life, you can see how important he was in the Belfast and Northern Irish and Irish generally literary scene. One of the things that I think Mairtín was very determined to ensure was that there is representation for a diverse number of voices, marginalized voices, community voices, and he was determined to promote access to poetry through creative writing workshops. The thing I didn't ever meet Mairtín Crawford myself, but the thing I remember or associate with him was in 1993, he brought his friend Allen Ginsberg, the famous, infamous beat American poet, to Belfast for 2 readings at the Crescent Arts. And some of you listening today probably were at those events, that they were landmark occasions. The year after he died, Lagan Press published his selected poems, this book here, if you can see it. It is a collector's item now. I think it's out of print. So there are plans, I understand, in the works to republish that selected in this year, 2024, the 20th anniversary of his passing. Moira Donaldson has talked about Mairtín as being fiercely tender but unafraid. And I think that sums up his person and his work very, very nicely. Just a note before I move on about Moira herself. She was the patron of these awards from 2017 to the present. She's just this year stepped back from that role, but I think we all owe her a great thank you for her contribution, the contribution she's made to nurturing poetry in that capacity. for so long. So she's handing over, not as patron, but as judging, as one of the judges, from herself and Anne-Marie McCracken to myself and Don Watson. So that's why we're here with you this year. I'll say a little bit about the importance of this award to a poet's career, and then we'll move on to some of the practicalities. I think this award, really like any award, it's not so much about winning as it is about the process of submitting your work, of thinking carefully about your work as you prepare it for submission, that's of real importance. Of course, it's validating to win an award, to place in an award like this, but it's very self-validating to have got to the point where you're ready to submit. And that process of careful editing, revising, selecting, meeting a deadline, the emphasis here really should be on process. And that's partly what today is about, is to talk a lot about the process. There's a great deal of self-validation to come from that. For me, that's the primary importance of any award to a poet's career, is that you've spent time with your own work that you mightn't have got to otherwise, and that is submission. It also, I think, enables you to engage with the poetry community just by virtue of being at this workshop today. You are maybe not meeting all the other poets that are here listening in, but you're part of something that isn't isolating, that you're becoming part of a community and coming to this workshop, and maybe others as well. It might encourage you to read the work of previous winners, and therefore they're all there on the Crescent Arts website. But that in itself, reading the work of other winners of the award, brings you into a community of other writers. It makes you aware of their work and who they are, what they've striven towards. So there's all that involved in how important, being part of submitting to an award like this is. If you are a runner-up or a winner, clearly there's, material validation, public validation of your efforts, recognition of your work that contributes to you building a profile as an emerging writer, to be able to say that you've been shortlisted or have actually won the award. It can be career changing to win an award like this, and it can lead to other publications. So there are many reasons why this is an important award, and it is one that is very much on the map in terms of literary ventures in Northern Ireland and further afield. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about those things. So Dawn, can I pass over to you to tell us a bit about the criteria, the practicalities of the award?
Hi, thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Dawn Watson, and I'm really excited and delighted to be a judge for this year's Mairtín Crawford Awards. They're awards that have just taken on such a great significance and importance, I think, for Irish writers, in particular. And it's something that I've followed now for many years. So to get the chance to do this is a real honor. I'm a poet and a writer from Belfast. My debut poetry book, We Play Here, was published in August by Grant of Poetry. I completed a PhD at Queen's in 2022 in poetry, which overlooked at, it sort of looked at the overlap between the lyric and narrative in Bishop's work, Elizabeth Bishop. And I'm currently a lecturer at the Seamus Heaney Centre in Queen's University, where I teach poetry and also prose. So some of the practicalities for applying to the awards, I'm just going to run through some of the submissions criteria, eligibility, closing dates, number of poems to submit, all that kind of housekeeping stuff. The Mairtín Crawford Awards are aimed at poets working towards their first full collection. What does that mean? So you might have published poems here and there in magazines or literature, literary journals, that sort of thing. Or you might have already published a pamphlet or a chapbook, but not a full collection. You might not also, you might not have published anything at all. And that's also absolutely fine. Both published and unpublished writers are invited to submit between 3 to 5 poems for the Poetry Award, with the only stipulation being that they've not yet published a full collection of poetry. Each poem must be no longer than 60 lines, not including the title or the stanza breaks. So all pages must include a header with the title of the poem only, No names is important because all entries are read anonymously. If the entry is untitled, then maybe you might title it with the first 5 words of your poem. Entries can be on any subject, any theme, any style or form, but whether that's a prose poem, many stanzas, single stanza. But the only criteria really on that is that they must be in English. The closing date for submitting your work is midnight on Wednesday, the 10th of April, 2024. You submit via email, which is on the website. You pay your submission fee, first of all, £10. Then you get an order number, which you then put in the subject line of your email. A short list will then be announced in May, and winners will be announced in June. And then that will be followed by a special awards night at the Belfast Book Festival. So the winner will receive a £500 cash prize. In addition, each winner can take up a time to write package, something that's really important for writers, especially when you don't maybe have a lot of space to write, which includes a 3-night stay at a hotel in Belfast and 4 days of dedicated writing space in the Crescent Arts Centre. 2 runners-up will each get £250 in cash. So all this information is also on the Belfast Book Festival website, so don't worry about writing it all down. But have a good read of it before you submit, and just check that you meet the eligibility criteria before you do submit. So a little bit about how to present your work for submission. How do you put it on the page? What should it look like? Are there any important things to bear in mind? The first thing would be the formatting of your piece. All entries should be typed, single line spaced, black font, 12 point, in Times New Roman font. Now, all of that is just an industry standard requirement. So if you're sending your work off anywhere to be published, you may know already that that's really the kind of standard criteria for how it should look on a page. It's just easy to read, and it's easy to sort of compare poems that are of similar lengths. Spelling as well, do a spell check. It seems like an obvious thing, something you're told for years and years, but it saved many lives at the last minute, my own included. Everything should just really look like it looks on the page of a book. The visual impact of a poem is just always important. So you just don't want lots of different font sizes, lots of different colors, lots of times Comic Sans or anything like that. You want things just to be quite simple in terms of their font. No pictures or drawings. They're unnecessary, and in fact they're kind of a bit distracting when it comes to poems. Sometimes they can really take away from the visual impact of an image of what a poem is doing by itself without any sort of help from a picture. If your poem does run over the page, take a new page for any new poem that comes after. Just let your work shine on the page, give it space. Allow as much time as possible between the writing of the poem and the sending of it. Just let it sit, revisit it, edit it, and give it space. Let someone you trust read over it, give you some feedback. And then finally, it's okay to experiment as well. It's okay to intentionally disrupt your lines. Poems don't have to hug the left margin. Equally, you might write 3 to 5 pages of poetry that sort of form a sequence of poems, or in fact work as a narrative in a sense, as long as each page observes that kind of maximum 16-line rule, then that's absolutely fine. Lastly, last point before we move into questions, just a brief bit about our job as judges. Kathleen and I will read all the poems, so absolutely everything that you send will be read by me and Kathleen, every single entry, and we'll discuss them in depth behind the scenes. From there, we will create a long list and then a short list. I had the honour and pleasure of meeting Kathleen for the first time a few months ago, and we've met a few times since then. And we're both very much share the same spirit of giving careful thought and consideration to every single submission that comes our way. So we're really looking forward to reading your work. So we have some questions that we've sort of quite commonly asked, which we'll maybe take a bit of a run through. Also, do submit your questions to the chat, and we will keep an eye on that and answer any of those as well. Firstly, okay, Kathleen, what are we looking for? What makes a good poem?
Yeah, it's a question you get asked a lot. I think for me, my first response to that is always I want to be surprised. I want to be shown the world in a fresh way. I want to be made to think differently. And I suppose I think it was I'm trying to think what poet it was that talked about the lightning strike. That when you read a poem that really works for you, you feel that sort of shiver of a lightning strike has hit the bolt of lightning to the top of the head. It's that kind of thing. And that's hard to define what exactly is that. I think it's a combination of many factors. For me, it is very much about a voice, a voice that's distinctive and unique in its own way that I can sort of hear it speaking to me. But on top of that uniqueness, there's the technical accomplishment of it as well. I think any reader is impressed by a poem that shows careful attention to craft, where the writer has really spent time and edited the work. And that doesn't show in kind of any visible way, maybe other than everything's as it should be on the page. But to me, it's the combination of those things, the surprise, the voice, the technical accomplishment, that when those are in equal balance, I'm going to read it again. Also, maybe that it stays with me. I'm haunted by it. I've been reading back through, as we both have, some of the previous winners, and a couple of those, I'm downstairs doing the dishes or I'm walking the dog and I'm still thinking about that poem. So if a poem has that effect, then to me it's a good poem. It's working. Don, what do you think? What would your criteria be?
God, yeah, those are great answers, great way of putting it. I did have a look at some of the previous winners, just to remind myself of what was submitted before. And one thing that I think is shared right across the board is just a real sort of a care and attention to language in terms of producing clear images. When I look at like Estelle Price's poems from last year, there was this kind of momentum that she carried through them. They were surprising, that like you were saying, Kathleen, they sort of take you on a journey. And I think maybe I'll come to more of that, but just poems that fundamentally on a basic level observe a kind of a beginning and a middle and an end structure. They take you somewhere and you feel changed by the time you get to the end. They kind of offer you a different way of looking at the world. Things as well. Jim McElroy, I think, was particularly strong with how he used sound. He had lines like, "We shovel sand and stones into the chunter." These kind of colloquial language. You don't be afraid of just writing in your own voice, the kind of language that you hear around you. Maybe avoiding that kind of archaic, highly sort of elaborate sort of poetic language that sometimes I feel like when you sit down to write a poem, you can kind of slip into this sort of register that isn't quite your own. Luke Allen as well. I mean, he was very sort of surprising in his poems. The very original language. One of the first lines of one of his poems was, "The best time to take a shower with the lights off is forever."
Mm.
Which is, I felt really kind of slightly wrong-footed by that line. It doesn't sort of make sense on some syntactic level, and yet I feel like I understand what it means on some instinctive level as well. So it's the language of the ordinary, not being afraid to just be ordinary with your language, but also, bringing in that element of surprise, that sort of sits alongside of that and presents a kind of a tension.
Yeah, I think too, Don, for me, there's I kind of like open endings, like you're saying, there's a beginning, middle, end, and there should be, there is, but sometimes those endings are really open, or you get lines that were wrong foot you almost at the outset. But that to me is intriguing. I want to know more. And if I'm left with that kind of open ending, the poem is more likely, I'm engaged with the poem. It moves me into it instead of it being presented and tied up nicely with a bow. So that's something to think about when you're writing. Sometimes people think that their poem is finished when it has that kind of ending, but maybe if you take the last two lines off, you realize, oh, actually, it's more exciting if I don't tie it up neatly,
Yeah.
or if I begin actually two lines in instead of with the line I thought I would start with. So things, again, it's about the surprise, and also I think that you want to be moved emotionally. Sometimes the tear comes to the eye, and that's a good thing. To me, one of the most rewarding things when you do a reading, a public reading, is to hear somebody in the audience gasp. They go, oh, you know, and you know you've struck a chord then. And it's that kind of, again, to go back to that word surprise that I think we're both saying we look for, as well
Yeah.
as the technical accomplishment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. It is surprise and yeah, some kind of emotional trueness, you know, on some level. And yeah, often just the poem that you end up with can be very different from where you started. So yeah, I mean, you could start writing about the you know, the remains of the autumn leaves in the ground, and then by the end of the poem you realize you're writing a poem about your father or something, you know. And I think it's allowing that surprise to come forward and maybe knowing when to take out sometimes where you started, that turns out that's not the poem after all that you wanted to write. Yeah, just don't be afraid, just experiment and be fearless.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that sense does come through. That fearlessness comes through in the accomplished poem. The bit of a risk that's been taken, or more than a bit of a risk that's been taken, is often what appeals most. Whether that's in terms of the appearance of it, the structure, the visuality, or what's being the subject that's being talked about in the poem. Yeah, so don't be afraid to jump off the end of the springboard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
In terms of errors, what are the most common errors that you would come across, Kathleen?
Yeah, I think that mostly the errors aren't in terms of big ideas, because really one can write successfully about anything. So it's not about choosing the right or the wrong topic. It's more the technical errors, the the spelling mistakes, the typos, some of the things you've mentioned already, Dawn. Not having your name on the page when you've been told not to have your name on the page, that it's to be anonymous. Choosing the wrong font, again, putting the pictures on the page, those kind of presentational or technical flaws that can be easily caught before you submit, if you're a careful editor, or as you were saying, let someone else read it over. Those kind of things trip people up, because at the end of the day, it can be the difference between getting on a long list or a short list and not. It might be a very fine poem, but there are technical errors that then put another poem just that, foot ahead of you. So don't let that happen. I mean, those kind of common errors are easily dealt with before you submit. Yeah. What would you say are the most common errors you've come across?
Yeah, I think all of those things are that's it. It's like I mean, poetry is ultimately it's a very aesthetic craft. You know, everything you do is sort of launched into cosmic significance, you know, on the page, of whether you choose to end a line with a particular word. Everything kind of matters, and that can be the difficult thing about poetry, but also the sort of wonderful thing about it as well. But I suppose in terms of specific errors, I mean, there's things to avoid, maybe, you know, such as the use of abstractions, you know, abstract words, maybe, you know, if you describe, you know, be aware of how you might describe things on the page, like the day was sultry, for example. You know, it's kind of things that are not instantly obviously an image. You know, is there a fresher way to say it? Is there a way that's more imagistic, you know, that in a way that it transfers straight from the page into the brain of whoever's reading it? I think in the same way, just avoiding cliche, you know, it was cold as ice, you know, all these kind of, if you we all do them. I know I do, and it's really just on a re-edit that you spot them, and really see them as an opportunity to kind of think, where can I push my language? Where can I take out the thing that is a bit too pedestrian and actually sort of put in something else that's a bit more surprising. And that's it. And I think just on a very, very basic level, just the poem needs to just make sense on a narrative level. You know, whenever someone's reading your poem, you want them to be able to see what you're seeing. You know, where's you know, the where and the why and the who. You know, these kind of things. Where are we? You know, what are we seeing? And what's the feeling at the end? And just like you were saying, Kathleen, it doesn't need to be wrapped up in some kind of neat bow where everyone's walking off hand in hand at the end, but just sort of ending on some kind of emotional uplift in some way, not necessarily in a positive uplift, but in a sort of emotional spread in some way, that we're kind of being hit with a I think an image or a sound or something ultimately that just hands something to the reader or the listener. Yeah.
Yeah, I think too about that, on that point, that a poem that comes in, or a poem that you read that is using cliches or common phrasing, you almost have the feeling, not that the writer is lazy, but that they've kind of gone, well, that's good enough, that will do. Whereas you have the sense that, well, if you just worked with it a bit further and challenged yourself a bit further, it could have been that much stronger. Because the sultry day, you know, there could be many other adjectives to describe that day that really would have punched the reader, you know. So it's just maybe about, and we'll come into this later, I think, about editing, but setting the poem aside for a while and reading it later, you see those sort of flaws in it or shortcomings, and that sort of mistake of thinking it, yeah, it's okay, it's good enough to put in now, and very often it isn't quite. So that's, I think, a common error in terms of the language and the structure and the ideas and the way you express them through your language.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. When I think about why I come to poetry in the first place, why I would even bother to read a poem, which they're not exactly always the easiest thing to read. You know, you have to really think about them and sort of maybe you need to read them a couple of times. And it's because I kind of feel like I suspect, like all of us, I think I suspect that I'm going to learn something. I'm going to hear something that's going to just blow open my understanding of something that might be the most ordinary everyday thing. You know, if I read a poem about a cat, you know, written by Leontia Flynn in her recent collection, Taking Liberties, you know, I feel like I know cats, I have cats, what am I going to learn from cats? But I know if I read this poem that I'm going to see some other way of looking at cats. And when you see cliches and you see those kind of abstract words, it can sort of make you think I'm not going to learn something new here. I'm you know, and sort of you might back away from the poem in some way. So you just want to just avoid those little things if you can. Yeah.
And just on a very practical note, very material note, a couple of things I want to say about common errors. One is a trick I learned a long time ago for any kind of writing, and that is to read the work backwards, not for sense at all, but just to look for punctuation or gaps or problems in the presentation. That can be very helpful. I still do that all the time before I would send something out. And the other thing is about the way you submit it. It will say in the criteria that you can submit a Word document, which is fine. But if you have the software and the know-how to make it into a PDF document, which just means that it locks your lineation the way you want it. Because sometimes in the transmission, a Word document will change the lineation and then it doesn't look the way you wanted it to look. So if it's possible for you to do that, I personally would recommend you submit it as PDF document. Okay.
That's a good point. I actually feel when I convert a poem to a PDF document, it makes me, I feel like I'm looking at something that's been published. You know, it's like this kind of mental, I feel like I see it differently when I look at it in a PDF versus when I look at it in a Word document. And I do not know why that is, but
it just looks a bit more like a page of a book, like a kind of professional presentation. So that again is a kind of self-validation, I think, when if you put it into that format before submitting it. Yeah. Great. Okay, if you have any questions about any of that, do be putting them into the chat. I meant to mention that at the beginning. I'm sorry, forgot completely. But yeah, the chat is there, and I'm sure you're thinking of things that we're not. So don't be afraid to ask questions there. Some over time, people have asked about themes. I mean, in the criteria, it doesn't say that you have to have a specific theme, does it, Dawn? No?
no, there's nothing there in terms of, you know, if you submit 3 poems that they all need to be on, you know, loneliness or no, there's no need to have any kind of overarching theme. I think what you might find is if you write these poems over a sort of a period of time, a close together period of time, they might take on a theme that you're not even sort of aware of in some sense. But no, there's no need for them all to be about the same thing or even about related things. They can be very different. And in fact, you know, that they should sort of vary in terms of, well, I suppose we'll get to it, but in terms of their length. And you know, it's nice to sometimes mix up a short poem and a longer poem and different sorts of styles of poems. But no, thematically, no need.
We're happy to read any and everything in terms of topic and subject. What you might think about, though, because this is, as I said at the outset, a bit of a unique competition or award in that you are allowed to submit 3 to 5 poems. Very often it's one for a poetry competition, not always, but you do have the opportunity here to craft a kind of mini book if you were submitting the 5 poems. So within that, although there mightn't be a theme, you could think carefully about how you arrange them. We will be reading them in the order that you present them, or at least, they come to us in that order. So they're curated, so to speak. And you might want to arrange them in terms of length or subject or the way they relate to each other. So I think it's a good exercise in thinking about, if you're working towards a first collection, this could be a beginning to think about how do you order the poems within a certain number and create a little mini volume. Yeah.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
you just, again, just how they sit together, how that group that you select sits together is probably more important than thinking about an overarching theme.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's when it comes to that sort of time in your poetry career where you're sort of putting together a collection of poems, maybe you've written like 30, or you want to send them off, maybe you're looking at publishing a pamphlet, and one of the best things to do is to print them out and look at them on the floor and just kind of arrange them into, visually, how do they look, how would they look on opposite pages to each other. It tells a story in itself versus almost what's the first poem versus the last poem, and do we start softly and then go into a kind of a loud poem, and these are all just considerations that are good to get into the mental habit of doing.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to make about laying them out on the floor and looking at them in relation, because we write these poems individually at different times. You put them into a file, they appear on the screen in a vertical order. But I've always found it really helpful, particularly towards getting a collection together, to lay them out that way. And for this exercise, I think it's the same principle. You might have quite a few by this point that you have to choose from. And it does seem to be a hard thing to do. I mean, students and writer friends often say to me, will you help me with this? How do I select what I'm going to send to this journal or that competition? There's a subject is your best, somebody else might not think is your best, but again, you could talk with somebody else and see what they think about 2 or 3 different arrangements of the 5 poems, which works best for them. Yeah.
I just noticed there, Shauna in the chat says something, just ask something related to this. Just do the poems we submit need to work in a sequence, or can they just be a handful of good standalone poems? So they don't need to work in a sequence, but they can do, sometimes you might have a sequence of poems, and I think someone did on a previous year where they numbered them, and they almost were one poem but split into different individual poems that formed a sequence. That's just one thing you can do, but you don't have to. So just a handful of good standalone poems is also equally great.
I think what ultimately unifies them is not the subject, but the style or the voice that comes through. Again, reading back over the previous year's winners, very diverse topics, but there is a stamp of vocal authenticity, if one can say that, or vocal unification through the voice that comes through in them. So really, bottom line is submit your best work. Yeah,
that's it.
Okay. Yeah, I see there's another question there about what we're reading. We're going to talk about what we're reading at the moment a bit later on. So is it Sydney? If you hold on for another few minutes, we will come to that. And editing, yes, and we're going to get to how we know when a poem is finished very shortly. So okay, you're way ahead of us, all of you. But I guess at the moment we were going to look next, I think, at how you start writing a poem, and we'll come to how you finish a poem or know that it's finished a little bit later. Where do you get inspiration from? How do you get started? That's a common enough workshop question. I think under any circumstances. So Dawn, what if I asked you, how do you get started?
Yeah, I think there's different ways, aren't there? There's different things, different ways that poems get started. You know, I wrote, there's that one that there's the sort of there's the poem that just kind of possesses you out of nowhere. I remember I was on the phone to a friend when suddenly I just hung up from her and wrote the poem. What was it? I've forgotten the name of my own poem, but it was about teletext, and it was basically, we can talk about it by teletext, but I know it's impossible. And it was this poem that just came out of nowhere, and it was really about the idea of a breakup, and where you just kind of are communicating back and forth through the medium of teletext. It was really ridiculous and random, but it just came out of nowhere, and I read it and I wrote it in one go, and I hardly changed it, and it ended up in my pamphlet. But then there's other poems that, you know, you can really struggle with, and you start with an idea in your mind of something that you want to write about, and it's difficult to make it go where you want it to go, and that's another thing entirely. Often I think if I'm struggling to write a poem in the first place, but I have a sense of something about, I mean, there's something about writing a poem that can be just very aligned to being present in the moment, and sometimes just sort of writing about where you're sitting in the plainest, simplest way, using your senses. You know, how do things feel? What objects are around you? What can you see from where you're sitting? And just see where that goes. I think also, you know, one of my favorite things to do is to pick a formal structure of a poem. You know, you have sort of structured poems where the kind of the line ends in a certain type of rhyme, like kind of A B, C D C D, and these are things sometimes that they're difficult. They're difficult to do, and you try to make a rhyming poem that, and sometimes the need for rhyme at the end of a line will push your lines in a really unexpected way because you need to sort of meet this end point. But yeah, I mean, what about you, Kathleen? There's so many different types, it feels, of poem and
Yeah.
ways to make one.
There are. It's funny you talked about the telephone call, because I have a poem that happened very similarly to that. I was talking to a friend on the phone. I don't think she'd mind if I named her, the poet, Claire McCotter, and she told me about a raven that she was nursing. It had been struck by a car and it died in her arms, you know. And so I came away from the call and in one fell swoop wrote this poem, which is hardly changed at all, called Burying the Raven. That's a wonderful way to get a poem. It hardly ever happens. You know, usually you have a phrase or one word, something you've overheard. That's how it often starts with, for me, is just like something that keeps echoing, like one line, and then I start to build a narrative out of that, or a lot of associations out of that. I think that's why notebooks are really important, to keep a notebook with those things in it, you know, just the word or the phrase or something you've observed, because you mightn't get time to write it right then, but you've got a starting point. You go back later, that can be the kickstart, you know, that as Patrick Kavanagh talked about, the kickstart, how the anthology was great for the kickstart. And I think that's true too, you know, reading other poets. You know, if I'm really just not hearing anything, I'll go and start dipping into an anthology or reading a writer that I'm currently taken with. And it's not that I'm going to imitate or even take anything from that writer, but somehow it does something to what's going on in my head, and I start to hear a poem. So for me, it's very oral and almost musical, and like yourself, to choose a restrictive form can push you towards, you know, finding things you wouldn't otherwise. A Pantoon, a Villanelle, they're really demanding, but they are ways of saying, okay, here's a set exercise in front of you, and you're going to write the poem to this set of prescriptions, and it can be helpful that way. And I guess just brainstorming, just writing, getting things down, a few phrases here and there as you're staring out the bus window or wherever you are. And then later, those somehow, you know, the unconscious works in weird ways, and you're almost writing the poem without getting the whole thing to begin with, if you're collecting those fragments. Dreams can also be, I know, you know, Richard Ford, who says the most boring thing in the world to read about is somebody else's dreams, but I've never really agreed with that. You don't always have to tell your reader that it's a dream you're writing or writing out of, but they can be a really productive source. Been reading some of Catherine Graham's recent poems, fabulous stuff, and I think almost all of them have come out of dreams for her recently. So, those are sort of diverse places, ways that poems get started. And if I'm not going on too much, I think if you get really interested in something, start doing the research. I mean, get obsessive, and that will lead to more writing, because as you learn about an area or a person or whatever it is you're really into, the more research you do, the more things get again kick-started because of what you're knowing in that area. Yeah.
I think that does it translates almost also to ekphrastic styles of poems, where you might go to the Ulster Museum or look at a painting and almost just sort of try to describe what are you seeing in the painting, put yourself in the painting, just write it, and just all of these kind of tricks sometimes just to get started. You really do tend to surprise yourself a lot, I think, when you just start once you get started. I think when you're at the very beginning of your writing career, and something I did when I was starting out was look at some poets that I admired. At the time I used to read Simon Armitage's poetry. There was something very, very bizarre about his images that he used in his poems that always struck me as being almost the more strange, the more true they felt. And I felt like that was a kind of a lesson I learned at some stage, because life is very odd, and often when we see strange images in poems, it doesn't alienate us. It actually makes us feel more like, yeah, that's kind of how I feel. That bike is like a kind of toe in some way. There's that, just not to be afraid of that. But I think looking at, like, if you take a poem that you really like, try to sort of write that poem, but using your own words, or try to see where's the story turns, what point does the story go in a different direction, and do that, and do it yourself. And yeah, that's it. It's just finding that voice in some way that you can then do it more automatically. But
Yeah, and on that, just like going for a walk or going for a swim or doing something, physically active, and you notice stuff, there's days that go out of the house and you think, oh, it's another day, but you go out and look around, pay attention, as Timothy Findlay was always telling us, Canadian writer Timothy Findlay, pay attention. And when you do pay attention like that, I think you start to notice things that otherwise you kind of just put the blinkers on. But as a poet, that's part of your work, your life's work, your vocation, is to be paying close attention to everything around you, from the language to the environment, what animals are doing, what other, the psychology behind what's happening. All of that feeds poetry, I think, and gives you a starting point for something. So
yeah, just getting it moving, isn't it? I think the title of my book that came out last year came to me when I was running, and I stopped at the traffic lights and I got my phone out and I was trying to type it in my gloves, and the beeps when I was walking across the road. But yeah, it's something about just getting the energy moving, getting out of the house. Yeah, it just can really help the brain as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And on the notebooks again, just keep it with you at all times. I mean, I think it's the writer's best friend is the notebook. As much as we have, the phone to record everything, I would still keep a little notebook everywhere I go, just because I'm sure it'll be there. I've lost so many things in the digital world, but to keep those moments, like you're saying, you're hunting for the phone to write that down, because we do forget so easily. So keep the notebook, and that can be the starting point for many's a poem, I think.
Yeah, that probably links into to another point, which is what advice or strategies for when you're stuck on a poem. I think a lot of that probably translates into that as well. Fragments, jotting things down. But yeah, some poems do need to be abandoned, don't they? Some poems just never seem to come together, no matter what you do.
Yeah. Some you just do throw in the waste bin, but I usually, the ones I delete, I would call them deleted or abandoned, maybe keep a file folder of them nevertheless, because you just never know, and you might think, oh, right, there was a word or there was a phrase once upon a time from one of those, but there's times poems just don't work, and you know it, and you move on then.
Yeah, I remember reading a piece of advice years ago, which I can't remember who said it, but it was just to use everything, use everything, everything you, I don't remember what book that was out of, but it's just every good image you have, that you note in your phone, just use it, use it, use it. Don't store it up for like a future poem that you think is going to be really good. It's just try to kind of keep that energy going. You will think of other things, you'll think of new, better things. And just sort of live in that knowledge.
Yeah, and also in terms of being stuck, I mean, yes, I've already mentioned reading other poems, but not just poems. I mean, essays by writers I find very inspiring.
Yeah.
And again, we're going to talk about some resources at the end, but writers are very good at writing about writing and can give you guidance, instruction, but also inspiration, as much as reading more poetry or fiction or look at films. Any of those things I think are also, they're ways of getting started, they're ways of getting unstuck too. Is just to let another medium kind of speak to you, or again kickstart something for you. Or go on to something different. If you're really stuck with one poem, start another one, or go back to the draft of a different poem altogether, and something there will unlock what you need for the piece that you are stuck with. Nobody says you have to sit down and beginning, middle, end today. It's a process. It really is a process. And I find in my own practice that I'd be writing constantly kind of in my head, no matter what I'm doing. And it's ongoing, it's not, there isn't a set time that makes it happen necessarily. So it's important to keep in that process, as you say, Dawn, and just stick with it. Yeah.
Let me see.
Okay. Oh, I guess that too leads on to thinking about older work, draft work.
Mhm.
What do you do with that? We've maybe answered that question in some measure, but I do think it's always good to go back and edit an older draft with fresh eyes. I mean, you experience, time, a night's sleep can make a difference in how you look at a draft that you were about to abandon.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead, please.
well, I think so. I absolutely agree. And then I think the other flip side of that is sometimes just when you feel like it's not working, I think just pushing on through and getting everything down while you're in this particular frame of mind, onto the page, because I've often revisited poems that I've written when it was, I ran into this man driving a tractor when I was in South Carolina one year, and he was telling me about how his his wife's grave was somewhere in the garden, and he started telling me this kind of history of this, and it was so bizarre, and kind of it left me feeling really haunted. And I went and wrote sort of down a lot of feeling, a lot of that, what had just happened, the smells, the visual aspects of it. And it was hard to revisit that later because I just wasn't in that place anymore, and I wasn't in that moment. And so almost just getting it all down, maybe you can come back and sort of shape it later. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
think that's why, like notebooks or journals, even, like I wouldn't keep a day-to-day journal of what I did, but things like, if I've had a really striking dream, I want to write that down instantly so I've got those images. And it's just stream of consciousness kind of writing. But if you can do that, with a poem, like you're just saying, you have this experience, and it's really important to get it down while it's fresh, while the feeling is fresh. And
yeah,
the editing, the redrafting can bring the language and the structure and the form and the precision to it. But you need to go into that moment that it's of it happening while it's fresh and alive, or you will lose it.
Mm.
So
And then I suppose that links into Audrey's question, how do you know when a poem is finished? And any advice on editing?
mhm. Well, my immediate reaction to that is it's never finished. I think as well as trying to write poetry, I've tried to write essays about other poets, and as you do that, you look back over the original publication of a collection, and then the selected, and then the collected, and you will often see variations between those that they've consciously worked on it. I know I did that. I mean, did a selected a few years ago, and I rewrote things that I was ashamed of juvenilia. I tried to bring something a little bit more to them. So in a way, you're never finished fiddling with it, but I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? When is it actually at the
Yeah,
point you can say it's done?
yeah. You can overwork things in a way too, where you just keep on and keep on, and you sort of eventually feel like you've lost the spark of what made it interesting to begin with. I think of Robert Frost's words about a poem being a momentary stay against confusion. And I think of a poem sometimes, I like to think of a poem as this tiny thing that's making its own stand somehow. And if you feel in any sense like you've created something that is doing that, then I think you're done. I think that you can always edit, you can always, whittle it further, take out any extra words. But ultimately, I think you know yourself if you've presented what you came here to do, isn't it? What the poem's telling you to do, in some way. And the rest is just down to form, isn't it? And just what's the clearest way I can say this. But just
Yeah.
getting it all down to begin with, getting everything, getting the feeling, the emotion down. I think the rest can be revisited, can't it?
Yeah, I think, once you have worked with it, some poems, as we were talking about, just are almost there first draft.
Yeah.
Others require a lot of work, but I think you do reach a point where you think, I've done everything I can for this poem. I've brought all that I have now as a practitioner to bear on it. Then you're ready, you say, okay, I will send this out. It is ready to go. But that can take weeks of editing, months even,
Yeah.
of visiting and revisiting, coming back to it. So it's kind of when it's down to the very core of it, that you feel you've cut away everything that isn't necessary, you've fine-tuned what is there, and you've said what the poem asked you to say. Then maybe that's the time to let it go.
Mic drop. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
There's a couple of questions. Yeah, what does our day-to-day practice as poets look like? Yeah, Joy's asking that. Do you intentionally prioritize time for writing, or just fit it in around the rest of life? Um, Joy, are you saying that poetry isn't life? Poetry is life. I think for me, honestly, it's like we were just saying, sometimes poems just happen upon you. I wrote this bird poem it's called Bird on a School Path. It's this tiny little thing about a swearing bird pecking, and I wrote that on my phone originally as a tweet when I was sitting outside waiting to pick my son up from school. And there was this bird like pecking around furiously in the bushes. But generally speaking, I find the morning to be my clearest thinking time. It's the time when you'll get the most sense out of me. I think when I try to write emails, even in the afternoon, I'm definitely very confused, difficult to follow what I'm talking about. And as the night goes on, I think that depending on the type of thing you're writing, sometimes an evening or nighttime suits it, But I do try to make time in the mornings when I'm writing. I do try to. At the weekends, it's hard when you're working during the week. It's hard when you're going into work for 9, or you're trying to fit in the gym, or you're doing a school run. It's very, 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 very difficult. For me, I do try to make it a priority at the weekends when I have some time to myself. But it's definitely hard, and it's never just one way. I think it's whenever I have space, you kind of grab it. What about you, Kathleen?
Yeah, similar. I mean, I don't really have a set number of hours per day that I would write. I'm not so sure poetry or poets work that way. I think maybe novelists can, or people that are writing critical books can set aside, 2,000 words today, but I've never found it works that way. It really is just when it happens, I make time for it, and really everything else goes out the window, which is in some ways is a bad thing, because I'll put off doing the poem because I know it's gonna obsess me and take everything else. There will be no housework, there will be no nothing done. But that's how it works for me. Once I'm into it, I'm really into it, and that piece of paper goes everywhere. But then it could stop for a couple of weeks till I've got something else that does that to me. Other things, I mean, I have been away on residencies and retreats, and holidays, are great because you've got a bit more time to yourself. You can sit somewhere quietly. And I've always really tried to make use of that time, treasured that time, but it's not always possible. So I think poetry is just, it's part of life, very much part of life, and it's happening when you're doing other things, which is kind of going in circles and saying keep those little notes and stuff for the moment that you can sit down. But I agree with you, Dawn, morning is the clear-headed time.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I suppose that another question was, what does our day-to-day practice of sports look? I suppose that kind of answers that question as well.
Yeah.
What are the things that help us, that helps you, Kathleen, as a poet? Is there anything that helps you with your craft in general?
I really think reading. I mean, I've said this to students for many years. If you want to be a writer, read other good writers. And now, I'm many years on from starting writing poetry, but still one of the most helpful things is to read other writers and to listen to them. There's so many resources online, on radio, on television, even now, where you can going to readings. That I always find gives an uplift and an inspiration, because I think it immerses me in language, and I need to hear language, whether it's written or performed. So that's a big importance to me in having those models. I mean, seeing a variety of techniques and strategies, and I think, yeah, I'd like to try that. There's some really interesting, innovative young writers doing things with form, visuality, documentary stuff that it livens you. So it is other writers, I think, that really inspire me or are important to me in terms of helping my own practice, as well as things like art, visual art and listening to music. All those things help me. Yeah. And you?
Yes, similar. I think, like it is really important, like you say, to have those sort of trusted friends that you can, sometimes it feels like you're imposing on people, but to ask them to read your work. Like things that helped me when I was writing We Play Here, actually I feel that, film was a really important thing for me. Some of the, one of my favorite films is the film Stand By Me, which was directed by Rob Reiner in the early 80s. And it was originally a short story by Stephen King. And it was about these four boys that go on an adventure into basically across, they leave their little small town in America and go looking for a dead body. And on the way, they're on the cusp of puberty, they're on the cusp of turning into teenagers. And there's something about that landscape, that childhood landscape, that's always been really important to me to try to sort of access in some way, and feels very alive to me. So I wanted to write a book that really was looking at four girls doing something like that. This idea of this, you can grow up in very difficult circumstances, like the four speaker girls in my book, where they're from sort of absolute poverty in North Belfast in the 80s, but they find this imaginative way to survive that, and sometimes that's really what poetry is, for a lot of people. As Anne Carson said, if prose is a house, poetry is a man on fire running quite fast through it. I was thinking about that the other day, like, what does that mean? There's something about poetry's power to sort of disrupt the status quo, and that's, for me, the idea of writing a sort of a book of poem sequences that gave girls perspectives, females perspectives, and in a kind of a type of adventure world that is normally reserved, but it seemed to me, for boys when I was growing up, was really important. And I think just that things like Elizabeth Bishop was said, a poem should surprise you, like we've already sort of said that. And I think about that constantly, whenever I think a poem's finished, when I think about why I'm writing a poem or what the project is, I just feel like, does it have the power to surprise myself? Am I going to learn something from this? Yeah, those are the kind of questions I feel like I just try to keep in my mind. But yeah, taking definitely just taking inspiration from other art forms is really important as well. You can sort of think, well, how can I conceptualize that in my own way?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because now that you mention that film, I can see how, not that you've based your book on that, but I can see how much of an influence that could be. And it's interesting because I've done a book recently. It's not quite a book yet, but that really came out of a film as well. And it doesn't look anything like a film, but it's a long sort of epic narrative thing now with its fragments, 3-line fragments. But without that film to begin with, I don't think I would have done it quite the way I did, because it gave me a sense of a narrative that could be, areas that are juxtapositioned. And so basically the point is other art forms can give you models for what you do in your own poetry. I mean, another book I did was, I felt it was like an art gallery, that each poem was like a painting. I mean, I really intended that. And then I did that again with another series about my father. I thought, each one of these I want to be as a sort of cubistic whole that looks at a character through very visual, but rendered literarily. So yeah, and then we're kind of maybe laboring that point, but I think it is quite important to think about how other art forms can give you structures as much as ideas for what you want to do with sequences or whole books. Yeah.
That's it. I think like on a really basic level, the things that help are just peace and quiet, eating well, exercise,
Yeah.
keeping your mental health as good as you can, just kind of as clear as you can. You're looking after yourself, trying to get some good sleep if it's possible, just all the things that help us as writers, as poets, as people in the world. But poetry can be just it can be a very fun thing. And it can also just be a very intense thing as well, depending on what it is you're writing about. So I think keeping that network of people and if around you who can sort of give you feedback, and provide you with a sort of four walls of support. But we don't always have access to that as well. So it's maybe finding ways to reach out and find other people like that, whether it's contacting writers groups or but just trying to reach out and find other people that are like-minded is really helpful.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any general
Yeah, general tips.
Yeah.
In thinking about this, I guess I kind of went off into the area of self-administration. That is, and it's connected to what you were saying, Dawn, just about being healthy in terms of your practice. And one way of doing that, I guess, is keeping a hold of what you're doing with your writing. Is as practical as keeping a record of where you send things out, the dates, how many poems, where they've been accepted, where they haven't. A lot of journals or publishers don't like you to submit the same work somewhere else at the same time. So keep track of that when you're looking at criteria, just a record. Some people would do a spreadsheet, some people do it in a diary. I just have a typed document that tells me this has been submitted here, this has been accepted there, so that you know where you're at with all your work, because you can be writing and writing and writing and maybe sending stuff out, maybe not, but the whole self-administration side of being a poet is important too, and keeping on top of available or what we'll call submission windows. When is the journal accepting things? Keep on top of that, and that goes in the diary. If I see one that I'm interested in submitting to, I'll put it in. Okay, that's due by the 21st of April, that sort of thing. I think it's very basic advice, but I think that's a tip I would give, is to just keep track of all that that you're doing with your work. Yeah.
No, those are great. I don't think I have anything to add to that. Do you have any books or poetry collections that you're reading at the minute that are inspiring you in any particular way, or anything that you've read recently?
Yeah, I have stacks of them. They build up like mushroom piles around my house. But in thinking about this, so one I would mention right off the top is just won the T.S. Eliot Award, Jason Allen Paysant's book, which I found really, really intriguing. It's called Self-Portrait as Othello. The book that I just did recently was called Double Self-Portrait with Mirror. So anything, with a self-portrait kind of intrigues me. But he's of Jamaican origin but lives in Britain, and he's looking at, I guess, Black masculinity through the figure of Othello. And this book in itself, I think, is fabulous. The different ways he uses narrative and structure and the visuality but the way that it also sort of speaks back to Shakespeare's play. And I'm by no means a student of Shakespeare. I was, contemporary modern literature, but it's driven me back to reading Shakespeare. So, finding or certainly that play anyway, as Othello, I would really recommend that. It's published by Kirkconnett. So that's my one of the moment. Any for you, Dawn, that are really speaking
Um,
to you?
at the minute, there's well, he's kind of a friend of mine, but Scott McKendry has a book coming out next in a couple of weeks' time. Actually, it's being launched down in Sailortown. He's from North Belfast originally, and it's a book called Gub.
Uh-huh.
It's just full of that kind of. It's written in a very Belfast vernacular in a way that I've never really seen done so consistently. There's a poem in it called Every Prole Home. In every poor home a rapture, and it's sort of about sitting eating gravy chips and making them into a wee slice of bread. Just doing something really, I think, exciting. Also, there's William Lepford. He's a poet I'll be reading with at the Stanza Poetry Festival in March. It's a novel in verse called From Our Own Fire, about a found family sort of sheltering in the woods, which I'm really enjoying as well. Then there's, I suppose, sort of perennial sort of for me. I always have Mary Howe's book, What the Living Do, is a book that's always sitting on my shelf. Just these really transcendent poems that are very ordinary, but they're also really extraordinary in terms of, she talks a lot about her brothers living and dying and how that sort of changed her entire writing aesthetic. Yeah, I mean, those are a few. Rachel Allen has a book coming out called God Complex, and she's another writer and editor who just writes a great essays as well, which are really worth reading.
But you're talking about novels in verse. I think when we first met, the first day I told you about this one, Roger Robinson.
Yes.
Robin
Yeah.
Robertson, sorry, I get mixed up. Yeah, that is a novel in verse, and it's also like a film. We've talked a lot about film inspiring poetry. It's called The Long Take. It's like a film noir, but it's a mixture of kind of memoir, autobiography with poems and prose pieces. I liked what he was doing with form there. Lots of little places I've marked, as you do when you're reading them. But I would really recommend his work, Robin Robertson. He's a Scottish poet, but that one came to my attention a couple of years ago. And again, as we were talking earlier, it's one of those books you buy for other people and say, you have to read this now, it's going to change your life.
Yeah.
So very impressed by his. Also Liz Berry's The Home Child, which is called, and I'm interested in the novel in verse right now, and her book, The Home Child, is again a series of related poems, as we've been talking about writing poems that might fit together but are individual too. She does that here. It's about English children who were orphans that were sent out to Canada during the 19th century to be servants, really, in big wealthy homes. And what happens to this one child who is actually related to her? She did the research and discovered it was one of her ancestors. So that one's a lovely collection, and you can hear her reading on the Poetry Society, etc. So that it could go on forever. We could be here till tea time telling you about all the books we like. But I think, when there is a poet that's a collection that speaks to you, it really can start something in your own practice. So read, read, read.
Well, that's it. Sometimes it just takes that one thing that I don't know if you have any books like that, but that you read and it sort of validates. Do you think, wow, that means I could actually do this thing, because I've just read this person doing it. And
Yes.
I felt like that about Leontia Flynn, a poem I read some years ago, back before I started really writing poems, a poem called Jared Manley Hopkins. And in that poem, it was things like gay this and gay that. Was one of the talking about super stairs, mental health, all of these things. And I thought, oh my God, so you can write a poem about this, can you?
Yes.
And it unlocked something for me. So just reading and searching out sort of like-minded folks, your tribe.
Yep. Yeah. And also I think listening to other poets read. I mentioned this earlier. I mean, we can go to poetry readings, but we can also listen to a lot of poets online. Now, you know, they're on YouTube, and or you can go to something like the poetry, you know, what's it called? UCD Irish Poetry Reading Archive, where a lot of Irish poets, ourselves included, I think, have submitted to that or been invited to submit to that. 8 or 10 poems by each poet. And yes, you get introduced to the subject, but you also hear the voice, and you hear, if you're, you know, aspiring to publish and do your own readings, it's a good way of listening to a variety of voices and reading techniques. You know, what's effective, you know, why does that poem hit me when I hear it? And very often it's because the way that it's delivered. And I think that's, you know, poetry is essentially oral. So to be aware of that as much as the written word is quite important. So that's called the UCD Irish Poetry Reading Archive. If you just put that into YouTube, you'll find, I don't know how many now. There's probably well over 100 there to listen to.
That's amazing, that one, I think, and also the Adrian Brinkerhoff Foundation. If you Google that, you know, you'll come across their website, and they also have a page on YouTube. But there's these wonderful recordings of poets performing their poems, just walking through the streets of Dublin or Belfast, and they're just saying their poem while they're being videoed, and it is really powerful stuff to see that and kind of think about how you might. I had the experience of making a couple of them actually, and the guy who was doing the recording was like, you have to, you know, you have to really think about the poem as you're saying it. You know, you're not just sort of saying it, you have to kind of perform it. And so they just really capture a certain emotion in those videos. But also then there's the Poetry Review, the poetrysociety.org, Poetry Ireland, poetryfoundation.org, just reading poets who are writing now, you know, poets who aren't necessarily dead. And people, there's so many current poets that are just out there doing really good work. Like a Sean Hewitt pops into my head, sort of Southern Irish, and just this really excellent on craft, really excellent on form. But yeah, there's so much, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. And there's Radio Molly, it's called. The Museum of Irish Literature has a radio station now down in Dublin, and they're always doing, you know, interviews with as well as readings from poets. So you can tune in there. And there's then the Verb. I'm an inveterate radio person, so I'm always listening to Ian McMillan's program. The Verb is great for talk about poetry and listening to poets read their own work. So just, it's a kind of about immersing yourself in whatever form you can find that nurtures your own practice, I think, in terms of resources. Yeah.
That's it.
Good. Is there other questions here we should be looking at then in the chat?
That's probably coming to the end really of the questions, I think. If there's any last things anybody wants to quickly ask, any last words? I think for me, just good luck, you know, really just you know, pick your best poems, put them in a file and email them to us. We are genuinely excited to read them, and we will spend time with all of them and consider them, and yeah, just really excited to do that. So just be brave, and it is about, like, I mean, like Kathleen said, like doing these kind of things, entering yourself into competitions, you know, whether you're picked or not. I mean, I entered this competition now, actually went back in 2017, and I think I was shortlisted, but I didn't win it. And I remember feeling disappointed at the time, but you kind of show yourself that you're taking yourself seriously, maybe, you know, just the act of putting it on the page, putting it in an envelope as it would have been then, maybe, and pressing send. You know, there's something about that just feels like part of the process of all of this. It's daring to be a poet, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, you know, we haven't really talked about the rejections that you get either from competitions or journals, but that's part of the game. You know, you do have to have a fairly thick skin and not to dwell on it. I think my advice in that regard is just, okay, they don't want it, somebody else will. And very often it's not because it's not a good piece, or you don't win the competition because it's not the best. It's because it doesn't fit I'm speaking really more about it, a journal, I suppose now, a journal rejection, but it mightn't fit with the theme. They mightn't have had an awful lot of submissions. And that's true of competitions. I mean, hundreds, and some of the really big ones, like the National Poetry Competition, you would have thousands submitting sometimes. CBC Prize. I mean, and so, you know, the odds are maybe against one to begin with, but it just accepting the rejection, if that's even the right word, the not being selected, it is very much part of it, and not to dwell on that, I think, would be my advice. It's hard not to when you're not chosen, but the longer your teeth get, the more you kind of just put the rejections in the drawer and move on and keep writing and focus on your craft rather than, as I said at the outset, the competition. You know, poetry writing isn't a competition, even though we're here talking about one and how to prepare for one. It's really about developing your craft. And
Yeah.
part of that exercise is putting the work out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Really. I think that's probably a good note to end on.
Yeah, or just to say I'm looking forward as much as Dawn is to reading all the work. I've judged other competitions. Always a pleasure to see what people are, the diversity of what people are writing about and the diversity of voices. And I think that's what Mairtín Crawford was all about, was nurturing that diversity. So hopefully we're carrying on that legacy by doing this. So get the work out there.
Yeah, it's fiercely tender and unafraid, isn't that?
Yeah.
Probably, Moira described his work, but yeah, that's probably the heart of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we shall sign off, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks very much, everyone.